Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Monday edition of Point of View, and certainly want to welcome you to the program today, and also maybe welcome me back to the program as well. Was out last week, had an opportunity to speak in a church in Florida, and so decided to stay there for a few days with the family, and want to thank Dr. Merrill Matthews for sitting in for 2 days, Penna Dexter sitting in for 2 days, and Chelsea Human. So we're back on track, but I want to thank them for some of their work behind the scenes as well as in front of the microphone. So again, hope that you are joining us today on this Monday. Over the next 2 hours, we're going to talk about two issues that I think are going to be very important, topics we address so often here on Point of View. One is, in this hour, will be America's godly heritage. Next hour will be the whole argument of intelligent design. But just before we get to that, let me just mention that there are a number of articles I've posted for you to read. And we will probably spend more time tomorrow when we don't have as many guests with us to get into some of the details. But one of those I wanted to call attention to was what I call paid to be unemployed. It starts out with a question. If you pay people to not work, what do you think those people are going to do? They're not going to work. And it's only common sense, but that seems to have eluded a lot of individuals, except maybe some U.S. senators like Ben Sasse and Lindsey Graham and Rand Paul and Ted Cruz and a number of others. And the reason I bring it up is yesterday there was a debate about that because on Friday we had all of 266,000 jobs that were created in the month of April. That sounds good until you realize economists were predicting that there would be 1 million jobs created during April, and it wasn't even close. So, of course, the questions were asked of the president and others. The president, he wasn't sure why not as many jobs were created, but, of course, he was sure it was Trump's fault, of course, and then made the unbelievable claim that there was no measurable data, that people weren't looking for jobs because it pays more not to work. The president needs to get out a little more and maybe talk to employers who actually, if nothing else, are having a difficult time trying to hire people for positions. One article I saw just recently did a calculation and said that if workers get maybe $16 an hour for staying home, why would they go out and work when that's basically double the federal minimum wage? So there are a lot of issues to address, and we'll certainly get into those later this week. We also have a very good article on the decline of American manners, and also one that fits in with our theme of really helping you to develop discernment, a piece by Rod Jenkins, How to Know When the Narrative is False. So those are some of the articles that we have posted today. But I don't want to take any more time away from our guest, who is Dr. Marshall Foster. If that name sounds familiar, then some of you old-timers remember the fact that we have interviewed him, for example, on his book, The American Covenant, which came out nearly 40 years ago. So it is time, really past time, to educate a whole new generation of young people, and maybe to remind some of you oldsters that there are some things you didn't learn about history and providential history in the classroom. He is the founder of the World History Institute. He founded that back in 1976. You may also be familiar with him, the Christian Home Learning Guides, also the Director of Education for the American Christian Tours. But this new version of the book comes out because it is actually tied into producer and former actor Kirk Cameron in what is called the American Campfire Revival Edition. And so he joins us now by phone. So Dr. Marshall Foster, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View. Well, I guess we'll see if we can get him in just a minute. And until we can do so, I will do my best to see if somebody can figure out how to put him on the air. In the meantime, let me just mention, if nothing else, that this article that I have pointed you to is an article that is based upon the idea that we only had 266,000 jobs created in the month of April. As I pointed out just a minute ago, one of the things that was so intriguing is Bank of America the other day estimated that anyone making less than $32,000 or less would be better off staying on unemployment rather than going back to work. So there you go. Dr. Marshall Foster, I think we have you now, don't we?
Yes, do it.
Very good.
Yeah.
One of the things I wanted to do is really just maybe go back in time, because when your book came out, I think it was in 1982, if I was correct. This is a resource that we need to put in the hands of a lot of young people today, as well as some older people that maybe have forgotten all the things that they need to know about America's godly heritage.
Oh, let me tell you. Yeah. During the Ronald Reagan era back in the 80s, and of course, I was giving seminars all over the country. And we did the book, The American Covenant, showing that America was founded on a covenant with God, beginning with the Mayflower Compact and all of the early colonial charters, and how that developed into the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, covenantal documents, and that's why America was blessed all these years. Not that it was perfect, not that people were perfect, but that they had basically covenanted with God, and by His grace had been blessed by Him to build the greatest republic the world has ever known. That is a story that Kerby 40 years ago was unknown, and it's really unknown now. I sold 130,000 copies of that book back in those days and went all over the country with it. But now I've redone it, and of course with Kirk Cameron, he has been on the air for 100 days. He just took a break for 2 weeks, and he's going to come back again, and we're going to be continuing with the study on a nightly basis on Facebook. He's got like 3.5 million followers. And basically, we're walking through and reintroducing the American people to the Christian history of America and why we were blessed, and what I believe is the only hope for restoring our country, which is to return to the covenants of our fathers.
Let me just mention for those of you listening, first of all, this would be a great opportunity to educate your children and grandchildren. And even if they're not sitting around by the radio right now, the good news is that you can send them later to the Point of View website and download the podcast or the video version of it, or go to YouTube. Now, again, you recognize some of the kids might not want to listen. Here's a suggestion. Maybe you can say, look, if you actually watch this YouTube video or listen to the podcast, when you're done, tell me just one thing you learned from that, and I'll give you $5, or I'll take you out to dinner, or whatever. Just some way or another to encourage them to learn something that they are going to learn, because they certainly are not learning it in the schools. And if it was important, Marshall, for you to have addressed this 40 years ago, at a time when we have the 1619 Project out of the New York Times, in which you have probably more promotion of Marxist views of history than ever before, I think this is really necessary. So we're coming to a break, and I want to come back and maybe have you talk, first of all, about what it is in terms of an American covenant. Also, how you and Kirk Cameron have produced 2 different films. You've co-produced some films with him, so those are some resources that people might want to understand. And how, if nothing else, this is very important information that we need. We needed it in the 1980s. We certainly use it and need it today in the 2020s. So let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Dr. Marshall Foster. If you'd like to know more about him, or about some of his homeschool material, or about the American Christian Tours, or about some of the videos that he and Kirk Cameron have put together, we have a very good link on our website, which is pointofview.net. Or if you're near a computer right now or smartphone, you can just simply go to worldhistoryinstitute.com. But we've made it real easy for you simply to go to the website. If you find yourself saying, I really want to get a copy of that book, I am so glad it's now back in print, and it is relatively inexpensive given all the things you will learn about America's providential history. So we'll come back and talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Often when I talk about the deaths of despair affecting so many young people, I am asked, why are so many unhappy? There are a number of reasons, but first let's discuss how serious this problem has become. In the U.S., the suicide rate quadrupled for young men and doubled for young women from 1946 to 2006. Another study found that suicidal thinking, severe depression, and the rate of self-injury among U.S. college students more than doubled over less than a decade. Dennis Prager suggests that the reasons for such despair can be put into 2 categories: loss of values and loss of meaning. The loss of values is easy to document in this country. Judeo-Christian values were important in the founding of this country and important in the maintenance of this republic. Also, middle-class values were important. This would include getting married, making a family, getting a good job, demonstrating self-discipline, and patriotism. Values were also lost when various communal associations declined. The Frenchman Alexis de Tocqueville explained that the strength of America derived from their professional, social, civil, political, artistic, philanthropic, and religious institutions. A second reason for despair is lack of meaning. Viktor Frankl, in his classic work, Man's Search for Meaning, reminds us how meaning, or the lack of it, can explain so much about human nature. Poor people can be happy if they have meaning, while rich people who have money but no meaning are usually unhappy. Religious faith can give life meaning, and more young people have no connection to religion. The fastest growing demographic among young people are the nones, those who define themselves as atheist, agnostic, or no preference. So many young people today are unhappy because of the loss of values and the loss of meaning. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today Dr. Marshall Foster, and his book is entitled The American Covenant, and this is a new edition, a foreword by Kirk Cameron, which is called The American Campfire Revival Edition. 8 chapters in this book, plus a number of appendices, lots of footnotes and other material, but also study questions at the end. So as you find yourself maybe reading through this book, you can also consider what you might do to educate others. This could be your children or grandchildren around the table. It could be a small group at your church or a variety of others. But Marshall Foster, for just a minute, let's talk about your relationship to Kirk Cameron. I've been watching that kind of from afar in terms of the films that you've produced, but this Campfire Edition, Campfire Revival Edition, I guess I should say, is something that is bringing it back to a new generation of young people and really trying to do this in a multimedia way, isn't it?
Yes, it's quite exciting because Kirk has got a way of not just simplifying, but bringing it right home to you personally, because he lives it. He lives the Christian life, and he really loves the Lord, and it just comes across. He's humble and yet very intelligent, and he takes my book, and for example, and just breaks out a paragraph of it, and sometimes I'll help him, sometimes I don't, but he basically just breaks it out in 20 minutes right in front of a campfire in his backyard. In a beautiful way. And what it does, it reintroduces people in a casual way, because they're not getting it in the schools. They're getting really a Soviet-style indoctrination of Marxism in today's progressive public schools, and that's been around since the 1960s when I was with Campus Crusade for Christ debating Jane Fonda at USC free speech platform in 1970. So, I mean, you can go back a long ways and see that the same people who were radical leftists and Marxists who were planning the overthrow of America in 1970 have now become the university professors and the presidents of the universities, and basically in control of the entire establishment.
And some of politicians, too, as well.
Yeah, right. That's right. And so this biblical worldview that you teach so beautifully on your program for so many decades now is so vital, because unless we have a biblical worldview, and that's true not only of our biblical view of creation, our biblical view of the Scripture, but also our biblical view of history. And if we don't see the Christian history of our country as something worth keeping because it's biblically founded, and that's why I called it the American Covenant, the untold story. And that's what Kirk began to unfold, is there is something unique in America. We can't give up the uniqueness and be canceled or be brought into wokeness, where somehow we're guilty of our past and we're guilty of all that happened even though it was the greatest, freest nation the world's ever known. That is to be canceled and taken away from us because of the guilt factor, which is a basic Soviet plan that goes back to the 1920s, and it's working very well right now. So how do you overcome that? You overcome it with truth and with God's power of working in the hearts of His people and their minds as they begin to understand that, wait a minute, God covenants with people, He covenants with nations. All relationships that God has on the earth are covenantal relationships, meaning of two people and God, or just two people. It is a covenant, a compact. When the Mayflower Compact was written, it's called the Mayflower Compact. It was a compact or a covenantal form of government. And why did the Pilgrims do that 400 years ago exactly, last November 11th? Well, they did that because they were following the Hebrew model that went back 3,500 years. They were following the Mosaic pattern of a republican form of government, which was given to us in Scripture. So it was a biblically based form of government without a king, where you elected your leaders, you elected a Senate, a House, you had local self-government in every area, you elected judges based upon character, and this is all you can read about it in Exodus 19 and following. It's just all laid out for us there, but it had been forgotten for hundreds and thousands of years, and finally through English common law and then through the various unleashings of the Bible in the 14th and 15th, 16th centuries, suddenly the people had the Word of God in their own hands. And at that point, they rediscovered the Hebrew Republic at the very moment they came across the ocean. At that very moment, the Pilgrims land, they go, wow, we could have had a V8. Here's the form of government that God gave us. Let's institute it in the New World. And they did.
Let's see if we can make
Republican history.
Yeah, and let's see if we can make the connection, because I think most people would look at the Mayflower Compact and say, pretty significant, and these were self-governing Christians known as Pilgrims, and certainly that is the case. But by the time you get to the founding of this country, you have this in your book, weren't we founded by deist, unruly adventurers and religious castaways? So I think even a secular historian acknowledge, okay, the Pilgrims, they were religious, but by the time you get to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, you really don't have that same kind of religious fervor. Can you now respond to that in some way or another?
Well, of course. At the time of our founding, 1776, 95 to 98% of the people were Protestant Christians. They were not necessarily all firm believers in Christ, but they were from that background, had been raised in that background. They certainly were not raised by French philosophes. They were not deists. They were not even Roman Catholics. There were no other people from other religions here. These were people who were Christians in their worldview. Not all of them, again, were born-again believers, but they all had been trained in the Scriptures from early on, most of them. And so this is true of our Founding Fathers, and of course especially our Founding Fathers who had gone through a Great Awakening. In the 1730s to the 1770s, there was a Great Awakening that swept through America that brought back that sincere faith of the Pilgrims that had been there, but it had waned until about 1730 with the success that came on in the next 100 years. But sure enough, God gave us a Great Awakening. And George Whitefield went up the coast. We had 1/3 of New England converted to Christ over a period of about 30 years, and 1/2 of the South. Many of your great founding fathers, from Patrick Henry to Samuel Adams, were converted in the Great Awakening, and literally, went on to transform the world. And this was a biblically based people and a biblically based structure. Again, we're talking about a Christian nation in principle. Not a Christian nation, meaning everybody in it is a Christian. And that's where your secularists will say, oh, but there were some deists. Oh, there were some founders who didn't believe. Yeah, there were 3 or 4 of the 56 that may have doubted the deity of Christ and been deists, like Benjamin Franklin, who said deism destroyed his life. He really wasn't in favor of it. He just happened to stumble into it. But the point is that the vast majority of people at that time were biblically based, and that resulted in our form of government being so great. And now people just want to tear it down and say, oh, no, we were founded on the Enlightenment. No, the French Revolution was founded on the Enlightenment. And that brought liberté, fraternité, and debaucherie, as hundreds of thousands and millions died in the months and years after the Revolution. And they went right back into dictatorship under Napoleon within 8 years. So it's a totally different revolution. One is the revolution that Karl Marx carried on over the last 200 years. We've seen those revolutions come and go. They always result in tyranny. And the one that works is the one that is biblically based, which we see, by the way, up in the monument in Plymouth, in the Forefathers Monument. The statue actually gives us that specific strategy of the Pilgrims, as if we would ever remember it or forget it. There it is, 80 tons of granite, the largest monument in America, sits above Plymouth Rock, and nobody even knows it's there.
Unless they watched your film or something of that nature. We need to take a break. When we come back, though, I want to get into what your history books never told you. And that was very significant for Kirk Cameron, because he points out that, wish I'd had Marshall Foster as my history teacher, because then, as he says, it's quite possible that my mother wouldn't be getting notes about me falling asleep in history class, because all it was a meaningless set of dates and destinations and dead guys. And so we have today oftentimes taught in the schools what could be considered a Marxist view of history, but many of them may not even understand that's what they're doing. But even if they're trying to teach sometimes a Christian view of history by saying, well, some of these people were Christian, one of the things that you contributed in this book, but also to the understanding of Kirk Cameron, was what is called the providential view of history. So I want you to come back and maybe explain that in some detail. And if you're just joining us, we're talking today about this book, The American Covenant. Some of you that have been listening to Point of View for decades might say, yeah, I remember our conversation with Marshall Foster when that book came out in the 1980s. Well, this is now a new American Campfire Revival edition, forward by Kirk Cameron. A lot of great additional material, some appendices, but as I pointed out just a minute ago, 8 chapters with even some study questions. So this is something that you can do in terms of pure study on your own, individual study, but you could also be using this in a small group study. So we're going to come back and talk a little bit more about what is this providential view of history? How does that relate to this idea of the American covenant and the history of our country? So again, this is something we think is very important for you to listen to and learn from, but pass it on to your children and grandchildren as well. We'll be back right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Continue your conversation today with Dr. Marshall Foster. Again, talking about the book, The American Covenant, and this is a new American Campfire Revival edition with a foreword by Kirk Cameron. And we're talking about this idea of an American covenant. But Marshall, let me come to the other very important issue, because we talk about this idea of Christian worldview, but part of this idea of Christian worldview is to view the world as a Christian in terms of history. And you go through in the book all sorts of different views of history, a cyclical view of history, an existential view of history, of course, a secular Marxist view of history. And we can obviously recognize that so much of that, unfortunately, has been taught in the classrooms of America. But one of the things that needs to be part of a Christian worldview is this idea of a providential view of history. Can you explain that to us?
Yes, the providential view was the concept really that Patrick of Ireland used to introduce to the pagan world of Europe a biblical worldview, that is, that God controls the heavens and the earth, not nature, not the druid gods, not the gods that are calling you to death, but the God who providentially will save you if you'll turn to him. And that God who created us is in control of all things. And I think one of the problems with Christians today is that we have picked up the worldviews of other religions, and we have forgotten our own, which is the true worldview. It is the one that exists whether you believe it or not, and that is that God is providentially in control of all events. He is not the absentee landlord that sits up in heaven and saying, well, when Jesus comes back, I'm going to solve the problems. He's the one that is solving the problems right now through his people. He is the one that's working and acting every day in every event and is involved in all things. And ultimately, providentially, all things work together for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose and obey him. And they do because of God's providence. And it is of great consolation. Noah Webster in his 1828 dictionary said, it is of great consolation to believe in providence and to know that God is with us. If God is in control, and if we're walking with God, then we fear nothing. We ultimately will fear nothing. We will fear God more than men, and the result will be liberty and freedom and the protection of human rights, the protection of the innocent. But if we believe that the devil owns the earth and there's not much we can do, and God will someday come back, but in the meantime we just got to go along to get along, then we'll end up compromising, like so many of us in this society have done, and just kind of trying to survive in our little culture of the church or culture of our homes. And that's not going to work. That's not allowed by these other worldviews. They will come in and re-educate you or kill you. They do not believe in equality like the Christians do. They do not believe in the biblical concept of all men being created equally and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. That is a biblical concept. And so we must come back to this biblical view. And when we do, it's so exciting because we can speak with George Washington and say, oh, but by the providence of God, I had 4 bullets through my coat and 2 horses shot out from under me, and I was unhurt. He says it's just by divine providence. And you can understand his providence and appreciate it if you understand that view of history. And our founders certainly did.
And again, when we talk about providence, just the other day we had the National Day of Prayer. So I've met people that say we should pray to God, but they don't necessarily have a providential view of history. And sometimes the lights go on when I say, look at the founders that used the word providence. You just mentioned one, George Washington. How about another one? A famous sermon by Dr. John Witherspoon, who was at the College of New Jersey. Today it's called Princeton, who gave a very seminal sermon on providence. And once all of a sudden people understand this idea of providential view of history, and if they take any time at all to go back and read any of the founders of our country, even those that are sometimes relegated as deists or Unitarians or whatever, they go, wait a minute, providence is all over the place. And yet how often do we not talk about that today? So I think that is still one of the most significant additions in your book. But you mentioned another one, which is in another chapter, and that is, where does liberty come from? And you have a whole section in which you talk about the fact that has been unleashed. And the view that you get today is, as well, it's these narrow-minded Bible thumpers that are intolerant. I think we're now starting to see that actually tolerance comes from a biblical view that are all created in the image of God and have value and dignity. And we're starting to see the woke culture, the cancel culture, and all of the rest who recognize that really if you don't have a biblical view of human nature, it's very easy then to relegate individuals as second-class citizens, and it's very easy to take away their liberty, isn't it?
Exactly. A biblical view of life, history, government, politics will lead you to understand the sin nature of man and the fact that we cannot trust leaders at any level without accountability. All people need to be accountable to equal and just laws and have equal opportunity in that sense. And that's what the Declaration of Independence was all about. It was built upon that biblical Christian foundation that all men are created equal. They're created by who? By their creator. And if you don't have a creator, you don't have equality. That's why you've got today in the woke movement, it's not equality. They want to have people be not equal. In fact, the wokists are defending their concept by saying we need to have control efforts. We need to force re-education sessions, scripted confessionals, mandatory apologies, cancel culture on the pretense that we need long overdue fundamental transformation. The terms are always the same. They come directly out of Gramsci. They come out of the 1924 Frankfurt Institute back in Germany that came over to America. These concepts will destroy us, whereas a biblical view of government will lead us to limited government, which is accountability of our leaders, and it leads us to Christian self-government. And that is our other problem, and that is we can't have that republic unless we, the Christian people especially, will govern ourselves under Christ and not allow ourselves to be either governed by the government or by our flesh. We have to repent and come back and say, God, it's me. I've got to be self-governing with my own family, educating my own children, studying your word, repenting of my sins, and then caring for the needy and the poor and doing what the scripture tells me to do. If the church will simply do what we're called to do, then we will be self-governing enough that I believe we can turn this country around in a couple of decades.
Let's, if we can, get back to that idea of self-government, because one of the booklets that we're making available right now to many of our donors, Marshall, is a booklet that I've put together on a biblical view of the Federalist Papers. And in particular, there is a couple of quotes that I have in there from James Madison. Now, if you want to understand James Madison, he studied under Dr. John Witherspoon, I just mentioned a minute ago, and really learned this idea of a Calvinist view of human depravity. And so as a result, James Madison, who is seen as the architect of the Constitution, of course, one of the presidents as well, recognized that you needed to do what you can to make sure that ambition rivals ambition. They split Congress into a bicameral session, both Senate and House. They had certain powers which were enumerated powers which were actually delegated to the national government, but the rest of the powers were reserved for the states and the people. And then they even had kind of a concept that we would separate the institutions of church and state, that the church would be separate from the government. And all of that, I think, goes back to that, if you will, that biblical view that if all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, we don't want to give too much power to any one individual. We want to find ways to protect ourselves from human sin nature. Is that fair?
Exactly. And when you lose that concept that men are fundamentally flawed to the point where they go after their own selfish interest to the deprivation of others. Once we come to realize that, then we are going to be for those checks and balances. But you see, in the secular humanist view of life, which is being poured into our children, a Disneyland view, all is okay, everybody's got to be, is good, and even the criminals need to be let out. We got, 85 or 79,000 violent criminals that are going to be released from prison here in California this month? Why? Well, because it's just the right thing to do. These are probably just good people that were misused and abused, and let's let them out, and they'll get better, maybe, because man is basically good or whatever. That's not true. Man is got to be accountable for his actions. Man is sinful. He must have restraints, and that's why you have to have laws. At the same time, you have mercy, and that mercy has to be built in from a personal level, not from a governmental level. You don't show mercy by throwing money at the people. You show mercy by loving them and carefully, bringing them into a better life through Christ.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, I want to get into one other issue, because Chapter 6 is who owns you and your property. And over the last 2 years or so, I'd say, Marshall, we've been talking about the value of a free market and of personal property rights versus what's being promoted today, and that is socialism. So I want to come back and get into that topic of property and property rights right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation for just a few more minutes with Dr. Marshall Foster. And again, 270 pages. No way we can cover the entire book, and that's why we encourage you to get a copy. But Marshall, before I ask you the next question, which is going to get into property rights, let's mention that they can go to worldhistoryinstitute.com. They can click on the button there that says American Covenant. They can get a copy of it there. You do have some DVDs and other things that are available. There's a digital download in case people want to get it that way. And most importantly, I think some people would like to know about the American Campfire Revival. So tell us where we can point our various computers to find all those resources.
Well, yeah, just go to the worldhistoryinstitute.com, and from there we'll direct you. By the way, and then also on Thursday night, you can get the book. You can get the movie Monumental, which is the story of the Pilgrims, which is the foundation of my book, and so many other things that Kirk Cameron and I did in 2012. You can get a lot of other resources, but then you can go from there. And we have a tour this is coming this fall. We're going to reopen America, a 5-day tour from Washington, D.C., right through New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and then ending in Plymouth for the great 400-year celebration, which is going to be a big conference that was put off last year. It's going to be this year with all the Christian leaders who are going to be there on October 2nd. So we're going to have a 5-day tour up the coast. They can learn about my 5-day tour. If they just go to worldhistoryinstitute.com, they can pick up the book. And also remembering that Thursday night on the campfire, Kirk is going to be teaching on family covenant for the next 40 days, coming up probably next week. And we'll be doing it during the week. But on Thursday nights is going to be Patriot Night for the next year. So you'll go on Facebook and with Kirk Cameron, you'll see him teaching on Thursday nights, Patriot Night, and we'll be walking through the American Covenant book. So you need to get your copy so you can actually walk through the questions, the answers of, how can we save this country? What are the fundamental principles? And I think, our hope is with the Campfire Revival, literally to see a revival of the hearts and minds of our people by the tens of millions. And that will make the difference in turning our country around, brother.
If you go to our website, pointofview.net, we have a link to the website. We have a link to the Facebook page. Of course, we have the information about the book, so it's all right there. You might be able to find the book in your local bookstore, but I think just to make it much easier, you can get it both in a paperback as well as a digital download and all the rest. But before we run out of time, I did want to at least camp out for a minute on Chapter 6, Who Owns You and Your Property? Because, Marcia, you know as well as I do that this idea of socialism has really caught especially young minds by storm. And the younger you are, the more likely you are to think that maybe socialism is preferable to capitalism. Our older audience can't even imagine that, but nevertheless, that is the case. And it gets us into this whole idea of private property rights, because not only do we have a country that was founded on godly principles and a republic, but it also was based on sound economic principles. And the Pilgrims learned early on that having everything in a common store, kind of from each according to their ability to each according to their needs, didn't work out so well. And if nothing else, a free market has still been the greatest genuine, if you will, engine for any kind of economic prosperity around the world, hasn't it?
Well, that's right. The Pilgrims were forced into communism. Their first 3 years they were here in America, and they literally starved to death. It wasn't until they turned to free enterprise and everybody had their own plot of land, so that the lazy had to work too, because everybody in the lazy were sitting around letting everybody else do the work. And that's what happens when you have communism. Communism destroys the character of the individuals. It destroys their ability to work. And God has ordained it that people would have private property. The thing that people have forgotten is the Ten Commandments are the basic commandments of all of human history when it comes to summarizing God's plan for humans. And a lot of that is economic. Take the Ten Commandments. 6 of the Ten Commandments deal with private property. They deal with protection of the family and the mother and the father and the wife and the husband, and then the protection against murder. Taking a person's life is stealing their ultimate property, and then stealing their goods, of course. But then how about destroying their reputation? All of these things are dealt with in the Ten Commandments, and those are all private property issues. And once you steal a man's property, both either his conscience or his money, you are taking a piece of him. You are literally making him your slave. And that's what people have done throughout history because they've broken the commandments. They do not want to allow people to have their own property. They want to steal somebody else's. It's human nature to get it from somebody else. It's just the way life is. So we have to protect against that and go back to a biblical view. Our founding fathers had that biblical view, and that's why Patrick Henry said, give me liberty or give me death. That's why they fought for their property. It wasn't that they were just interested in having a bigger car, more land. That wasn't the issue, although that's the way it's always presented. That's not it. It's when you give up your individual property, whether it be physical or spiritual or your mental property, your mind, which is what's happened with our schools. For example, we've given up our children to this. When you give up your property, then you have literally destroyed your life. and you are the slave of whoever you've given it up to. And that's not God's way. God's way is for each man to be under his own vine and fig tree.
Let me again mention that there are 8 chapters in the book, and some of them give you a little bit of a history of, for example, what your history books never told you, as well as a whole section on the Pilgrims and then the founding of this country, both the Declaration and the Constitution and the ideas behind it, as well as we just talked about a minute ago, who owns you and your property. Whole chapter, for example, on the genesis and the genius, if you will, of the American Republic, and even a strategy for success. And there's much more, because then there are a number of appendices that address such issues. And how relevant is this? Pandemic, plague, and pestilence, the difference between the French Revolution and the American Revolution, a speech that saved the U.S. Constitution, and something which, again, Marshall Foster is well known for, of talking about Scotland's influence in America. And so we don't have a time to go through all of that, but that's why we encourage you to get a copy of the book. And if nothing else, Kirk Cameron says the American Covenant, the Untold Story, has become the study guide for millions of people gathering virtually around a campfire in my backyard. My prayer is that this book will be a source of light and life to you and your family, as it's been for me and others. Endorsements from all sorts of people that have been on this program, like Jerry Newcomb and Bill Federer and many, many more. So again, it is a new version out called the American Campfire Revival Edition, forward by Kirk Cameron, and it is, of course, was written by Dr. Marshall Foster with all sorts of new information. And so, Marshall, it's just been great to have you back on the Point of View program, and I encourage people to contact your website, watch you on Facebook, and get a copy of your book.
Kerby, thank you so much for having me on, and you have a wonderful day.
Well, I appreciate you joining us today. And so that is our first hour. We have been talking about kind of a Christian view of history. And it's always sad when you have so much material in a book and you try to cover it in an hour. But I'm going to have that same problem next hour, because we're going to have Dr. Stephen Meyer with us. Now, we gave you kind of a preview of this a couple of weeks ago when Dr. Ray Bolin was in studio, because he had already gotten a copy of Stephen Meyer's new book, Return of the God Hypothesis: 3 Scientific Discoveries that Reveal the Mind Behind the Universe. One of the criticisms sometimes of the intelligent design movement is, okay, you say there's an intelligent designer. Well, who is it? And, of course, this one goes into it in a lot more detail, but helps us understand that you can stand on very firm scientific evidence that points to the existence of God. And so, again, we want to equip you with that. And these are very important interviews that I hope you will pass on to your friends, your neighbors, your coworkers, your children, and your grandchildren. So Dr. Stephen Meyer will be with us. Of course, he is an individual that has his doctorate from the University of Cambridge and has written quite a number of other books, as he has been part of the Discovery Institute Center for Science and Culture. So we're going to take a break, and we'll continue our conversation in the next hour with Stephen Meyer right after these important messages.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we're going to be talking about the subject of intelligent design, but in particular has the title Return of the God Hypothesis, 3 scientific discoveries that reveal the mind behind the universe. And you already got a little bit of a preview, because a couple of weeks ago we had Dr. Ray Boland, who actually is also one of the fellows with the Discovery Institute, in studio. And I, since he had a copy of the book ahead of time, had him kind of summarize it briefly for us. But we'll have a chance to go into much more depth. And of course, we wish we had hours, because there's 550 pages in this book, 450 pages of text, which I've looked every one of those pages. And that means there's 100 pages just of footnotes, diagrams, and a variety of other things at the end. And it is written by Dr. Stephen Meyer, who's been on the program with us many times before, received his PhD in philosophy of science from the University of Cambridge, individual that has been a college professor, a geophysicist. He now, of course, directs, as we've talked about, the Discovery Institute Center for Science and Culture. You can think of some of the other interviews we've done with him in the past: Signature in the Cell, DNA and the Evidence for Intelligent Design, Darwin's Doubt, the Explosive Origin of Animal Life and the Case for Intelligent Design, and this one, Return of the God Hypothesis. Dr. Stephen Meyer, always a delight to have you on the program.
Wonderful to be with you, Kerby. Thanks for having me on.
Let's, if we can, talk about the genesis of this book, which made me smile in some respects, because it started with a debate you've done. And over the years, for example, Dr. Norm Geisler and I and others, we've done debates, and I know what it's like when you're in a debate and you're having trouble thinking or having some clarity. In your particular case, you were basically having a migraine headache. And yet, as you were being criticized and attacked, as always takes place, most of these conversations devolve pretty quickly into kind of an ad hominem attack. You finally came from that debate saying, I think it is time to write this book on the God hypothesis. Tell us the rest of the story, if you might.
Well, right. There was a forum at the University of Toronto titled "What Lies Behind It All," and the organizers invited Professor Lawrence Krauss, a well-known scientific atheist, kind of the American sidekick to Richard Dawkins, and also a theistic evolutionist named Dennis Lamoureux, and me to have this discussion. And I planned to give an opening presentation on the case for intelligent design, but then in the larger three-way discussion afterwards to discuss the bigger question of the event, which was what lies behind it all. What are the, in my view, for me, what are the implications of intelligent design? And I've been increasingly asked that question after writing my first 2 books, suggesting that the digital information in DNA and RNA, and that these big molecules at the foundation of life that are loaded with information, suggest the action of a designing intelligence of some kind. Many of my readers have wanted to know what do you think about the identity of that designing intelligence, and what can science tell us about that? So I came kind of prepared to talk about that. Krauss had written a lot about cosmology and had written a book called The Universe from Nothing, in which he purported to explain the origin of the universe from nothing but the laws of physics, which he cast as a sort of materialistic explanation of everything. And I was really eager to talk about that with him, but I got this massive migraine. I was having trouble pulling words. A doctor took me to a dark room after my talk, and while the second speaker was talking before I came back up for the three-way, And I really had to stick to much simpler points. I was having such a difficult time pulling words. And at the end of the night, the person conducting the three-way interview said, "Well, give a summary." And I popped out with these three key facts: that the universe had a beginning, the universe has been finely tuned from the beginning to make life possible, and life contains digital code. And those three discoveries, I argued, suggested not just a designing intelligence of some kind, but rather they seem to point to a designing intelligence with the attributes that Jews and Christians have long ascribed to God. And after the debate, a lot of people wrote me and said they felt sorry for me with the migraine and all of that. But I realized, hey, this would be a great way to frame a new book. And so and this was the thing that many people remembered. Of all the back and forth, they remembered the summation at the end, and I thought, well, maybe it's time to write this.
Let me just mention that we have a lot of different links. One of those is stephencmeyer.org, which is on our website. Of course, you have returnofthegodhypothesis.com. And as a matter of fact, I just received some information from our good friends at the Center for Science and Culture, in which you have Brian Josephson, who is Emeritus Professor of Physics from the University of Cambridge. This book makes it clear that far from being an unscientific claim, intelligent design is valid science. No longer being called creationism in a cheap suit, as we always like to jokingly say. So let's see if we can get into this idea of science itself, because that, I think, is another value in the book before we get into the three arguments. Because today you have so many people, Stephen Meyer, saying, oh, I believe the science. But science really started from a theistic point of view, because there was an assumption that there was a creator God, that intelligent individuals created in God's image could discover those patterns. And so really the scientific method, and a good number of the first scientists were, if they weren't Christians, were at least theists. Isn't that fair?
Deeply religious men, by and large. And the historians who have studied this period of time, it's called the Scientific Revolution, sometimes dated from about 1300 to 1750, sometimes more tightly debated from about 1500 to 1750. But you think of figures like Johannes Kepler, Robert Boyle, Sir Isaac Newton. These were devout men, mostly Christian, and they were convinced that there was an order in nature that had been placed there or impressed upon nature by the Creator. And therefore, they began to look for what they called laws of nature. One historian of science says that the term laws of nature is a juridical metaphor of theological origin. And it implies that there is a divine lawgiver and law sustainer of the universe, that the orderly concourse of nature that we see is a product of the constant action of this divine being, maintains the order that we see in nature. In addition, as you just indicated, there was a kind of interesting watchword that these scientists had. They believed in the intelligibility of nature. They believed that because it had been created by an intelligent agent, namely God, and that same God had placed, had gifted us with rationality made in his image, that we could understand the rationality, the order, and the design that had been placed in nature. And that gave them an impetus to study nature empirically. They also believed that the order of nature was dependent on the will of God. It wasn't something that was logically self-evident. So you had to go and look and see. It placed a great emphasis on empirical investigation, whereas the Greeks believed that there was an order in nature, but it was self-evident to us. And therefore, they thought that simple philosophical reflection, armchair philosophizing, would suffice to understand the natural order. So there were a number of presuppositions that came out of a Judeo-Christian worldview, the theology of late medieval Catholicism, of the Reformation, and also from the Hebrew Bible that really gave rise to modern science. And that's in part the story that my title invites, the return of the God hypothesis. Science started with a theistic framework and with theistic presuppositions.
Let's take a break. We'll talk about how we went off track and how to get back on track. And we'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Often when I talk about the deaths of despair affecting so many young people, I am asked, why are so many unhappy? There are a number of reasons, but first let's discuss how serious this problem has become. In the U.S., the suicide rate quadrupled for young men and doubled for young women from 1946 to 2006. Another study found that suicidal thinking, severe depression, and the rate of self-injury among U.S. college students more than doubled over less than a decade. Dennis Prager suggests that the reasons for such despair can be put into two categories: loss of values and loss of meaning. The loss of values is easy to document in this country. Judeo-Christian values were important in the founding of this country and important in the maintenance of this republic. Also, middle-class values were important. This would include getting married, making a family, getting a good job, demonstrating self-discipline, and patriotism. Values were also lost when various communal associations declined. The Frenchman Alexis de Tocqueville explained that the strength of America derived from their professional, social, civil, political, artistic, philanthropic, and religious institutions. A second reason for despair is lack of meaning. Viktor Frankl, in his classic work, Man's Search for Meaning, reminds us how meaning, or the lack of it, can explain so much about human nature. Poor people can be happy if they have meaning, while rich people who have money but no meaning are usually unhappy. Religious faith can give life meaning, and more young people have no connection to religion. The fastest growing demographic among young people are the nones, those who define themselves as atheist, agnostic, or no preference. So many young people today are unhappy because of the loss of values and the loss of meaning. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue your conversation today with Dr. Stephen Meyer. His book is entitled The Return of the God Hypothesis. And Stephen, just a minute ago, you were talking about, of course, the idea of the return, but let's talk about how we went off track, and that is during the Enlightenment. There are various individuals, and we can put the blame at David Hume's feet or a variety of others, but these theistic arguments were set aside, and Immanuel Kant gets rid of sort of the cosmological argument, and others, for example, William Paley had a design argument. Now, we're going to come back to these in just a minute, but what is so interesting is due either to philosophers or their later maybe scientists like Charles Darwin, a lot of those got set aside, and I think the great hope in the 18th and 19th century was that the more we discover science, the more we learn more about the scientific method, the more we are able to understand the universe in its complexity and life in its complexity, the more we'll be able to explain everything without God. And for a time, it almost looked like it might be headed in that direction, but it's come, I guess to use a favorite phrase, as a bad dream, as if scientists were climbing the mountains of inquiry. They pull themselves up to the final plateau and find a band of theologians sitting there for centuries. Now, you know where that quote has come from, because in some respects, now the more we know about science, the more the God hypothesis actually makes sense, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, science did take a jag from its theistic roots in the 19th century, and with figures like Laplace, and who had the famed conversation with Napoleon, where he reportedly said he had no need of that God hypothesis. We're not sure if he actually said those words, but that was certainly the spirit of his work and the age. Figures like Darwin, Marx, who told us, gave us a utopian vision of the future that was based on, he thought, materialistic and scientific principles. Freud, who came along a bit later, told us what to do about our guilt. So you had Darwin telling us where we came from, Freud giving us a kind of secular eschatology about where we're going, and Freud with an account of what to do about the human condition. So by the end of the 19th century, you had this completely materialistic worldview that was all allegedly based on science, that answered all the basic questions that Judeo-Christian religion had always answered. And we inherited that worldview into the 20th century. But the big story of the book is that there have been major discoveries, especially about biological and cosmological origins, about the origin of life and the origin of the universe, about the structure of the universe, that point in a decidedly theistic direction, that challenge scientific materialism on scientific grounds. And so there is a shift, I think, beginning to take place again.
And again, that's part one of the book, but I'm going to spend most of our time on part two, Return to the God Hypothesis. And let's start off with cosmology, because that's one of the three. As a matter of fact, if you're taking some notes, you might number 1 to 3. And the first one has to do that as we see light coming from all of these galaxies, we have noticed a shift in terms of the red spectrum. Hubble and others have identified that. And the first thing it helped us understand is this original theory that the universe was eternal, thus it didn't need an origin, didn't need a God, was set aside because there was pretty good evidence of the fact that the universe did have a beginning. And that, of course, raises the question, what happened before the universe existed in space and time, right?
And what caused the universe to come into existence? There's a famous physicist at Princeton named Robert Dicke who said that an infinitely old universe would relieve us of the necessity of explaining the origin of matter at any finite time in the past. Materialism as a worldview, or sometimes also called naturalism, assumes that the universe is the thing from which everything else comes, the prime reality. Theism, of course, suggests that there is a personal God who brings the universe into existence. So the materialists did not expect to find evidence of a definite beginning of the universe. They believed that the universe was the eternal self-existent thing that played the role that was equivalent to God in a theistic system of thought. But what was discovered was that the universe, as best we can tell, had a beginning a finite time ago. And you're right, the first indicator of this was the light coming from distant galaxies. You can think of it, it was stretched out. The wavelengths of the light were longer than they should be if the objects in the night sky were stationary in relation to us. And longer wavelengths correspond to the red end of the ultraviolet spectrum. And so the scientists called this the red shift evidence, indicating galaxies moving away in every direction of the night sky, suggesting the universe is expanding outward, kind of like a balloon. But if you wind that time sequence backwards in your mind's eye, then what you realize is that galactic material would have been getting closer and closer and closer together until finally it converged on a point, marking the beginning of the expansion of the universe, and also arguably the beginning of the universe itself. And so that was the first indicator from observational astronomy of a definite beginning, and therefore a universe that needed an external cause. It wasn't eternal and self-existent.
Well, and again, let me just mention that also as we go through some of this, you might say, well, what about? You've got a whole section here called conjectures and refutations, because some people say, well, what about a multi-universe and a variety of others? So we may not get to those today, but I just want you to understand that the book is so complete that it even deals with some of the what about questions that people might ask. But before we move on, let me just mention that it isn't just the red shift. It's also that we have this cosmic background radiation, and whether people understand all of that or not, there are lots of different ways, if you will, to independently assume and thus conclude that the universe had a beginning. And once you talk about a beginning universe, it of course leads to the obvious question, what happened 5 minutes before the beginning of the universe? And it would have to be, by definition, someone who would be outside of space and time, because space and time are created in this event, and it would have to be someone who is more powerful than the universe, and that leads to an obvious conclusion that there's probably only one entity that is outside of space, omnipresent, outside of time, eternal, and most importantly, all-powerful to actually fulfill that particular requirement, which is why you find so many astronomers having to kind of roll their eyes when somebody says, well, isn't it possible that in light of the particular model of the universe you have, it almost demands the existence of God?
Right. The causal profile required to account for the effect in question is one that where God fits the bill. You can't posit to explain the origin of the universe, and what the scientists mean is not just the origin of matter and energy in a pre-existing space and time, because one of the other developments that has given rise to this conclusion is the theory of general relativity, Einstein's theory of gravity, which suggests that space and time are connected, and that matter actually bends, massive bodies bend space. So in the 1960s, Stephen Hawking showed in his PhD thesis that if the universe is expanding outward in the forward direction of time, if we understand the general relativity, we can understand that in the reverse direction of time, as matter would have been more and more densely concentrated, going back to that beginning point, space would get progressively more and more tightly curved until it reached a limiting point of ultimate curvature or infinite curvature, which corresponds to zero spatial volume. So the picture of the origin of the universe is literally one in which everything comes out of nothing physical, and space and time begin at that point as well. And this poses a huge problem for any materialistic explanation for the origin of the universe, because you can't explain the origin of matter if there is no matter prior to the beginning of the universe. So if it's matter that comes into existence at the beginning, then there's no matter prior to that to do the causing by definition. And so the way I argue the case is I show that theism or possibly deism provide much better explanations for the origin of the universe than does a materialistic worldview. And then I look at some of the other attributes of or features of the universe, properties of the universe that suggest other attributes for that cause, such as the fine-tuning of the universe, which suggests that that transcendent cause, something beyond space, time, matter, and energy, must also have been intelligent.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into that, because that would be our second point, the so-called Goldilocks universe in terms of design when we look at the far dimensions in our telescope. And then we'll come to the third, and that is, if you will, design when we look at the very small dimensions of life through our microscopes. And each one of those are things that in the past Dr. Stephen Meyer has addressed. As a matter of fact, let me commend to you, especially as we get to that third point, his book, The Signature in the Cell, DNA and the Evidence for Intelligent Design, and the Digital Code. So we'll get into those other two very quickly, and then maybe some final comments before we're done. But it's all part of this new book. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we also have some links to some of the websites that you might want to find for the Discovery Institute and the Return of the God Hypothesis.com. That is the title of this book, Return of the God Hypothesis, 3 scientific discoveries that reveal the mind behind the universe. Dr. Stephen Meyer with us, and he will continue with us right after these important messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again as we continue our conversation today with Dr. Stephen Meyer. The book is entitled Return of the God Hypothesis. You probably can find it in your local bookstore, but we have all sorts of information that you can find as well on our website, pointofview.net. You can go to returnofthegodhypothesis.com. We also, of course, have some other links that you can find there. You can get it in Kindle or also, of course, in hardcover. And I thought we would look at the second issue, and that is the fine-tuning of the universe, or what many are calling the Goldilocks universe. And it goes back to Goldilocks and the Three Bears. You know, everything is just right. And it is almost fine-tuned on a knife edge. If you were to think of it as a dial, a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right, you don't have a universe. You don't have a solar system. You don't have a place for human life on this planet, whatever it might be. And that is another one of those sort of unexpected but incredibly powerful arguments that many scientists are now discovering as they look at how the universe really is finely tuned, almost on a knife edge.
Yeah, actually, a knife edge is understating it, Kerby. There's so many of these basic physical parameters of the universe that make it possible, not just for life, but even for stable galaxies, rocky planets, and even basic chemistry depends upon this fine tuning. So one example is the expansion rate of the universe and the force, more importantly, the force driving it. That we were just talking about how the universe is expanding outward from a beginning point. The force that's driving that is called the cosmological constant. An accepted value for its degree of fine tuning is 1 part in 10 to the 90th power. So if it was just a tiny smidgen, a stronger force or a little bit weaker in either direction, a life-conducive universe would not be possible. So to put that in perspective, that would be like there are 10 to the 80th elementary particles in the universe. So that would be like us going out into space, blindfolded, looking for one elementary particle, but not just in our universe, but in 10 billion universes our size, and hoping that you would stumble across that lucky particle. And so this is the degree of fine-tuning, or the engineers know of the concept of tolerances. The universe has to fall within very fine limits in all these different physical parameters to make life possible. Fred Hoyle, one of the astrophysicists who first discovered some of the most important fine-tuning parameters, said that common sense interpretation suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics and chemistry in order to make life possible. Hoyle, a former atheist, came to a kind of quasi-proto-theistic position because of his own discoveries of these fine-tuning parameters. So it's been a striking and very exciting discovery in modern physics that the universe didn't have to be the way it is, and it has the properties necessary to life, and the combination of all these properties is almost beyond computation. It's so improbable.
It certainly is. And again, you go into that in some detail, and I am struck by the number of astronomers and cosmologists who aren't necessarily believers, but nevertheless say, it's almost as if the universe knew we were coming, and all sorts of things about fine-tuning. But again, that one is probably well known because we have covered that quite a bit. And I wanted to spend some time really focusing on one that you have really worked on, and that is the digital code. You have a whole section here first on the origin of life, and you actually give very good credit to an individual that I used to work with, Dr. Charles Thaxton, and when he and Walter Bradley and Roger Olson wrote The Mystery of Life's Origin. You also talk about Dr. Tours at Rice and a number of others, but whether it's the Cambrian explosion, which you talked about, of course, in Darwin's Doubt, or whether it's this incredible digital code that has to be just perfect. And anybody that's ever written computer programs, and I put myself through graduate school doing so, all you have is one mistake and your computer program doesn't work. The same thing holds with the kind of digital specificity at the molecular level. Can you kind of explain that to us?
Well, right. We all remember from high school biology class the discussion of Watson and Crick elucidating the structure of the DNA molecule and its beautiful double helix structure. That occurred in 1953. About 5 years later, Francis Crick formulated something he called the sequence hypothesis, in which he proposed that the chemical subunits that run along the interior of that twisting helix, they're called bases or nucleotide bases, are functioning like alphabetic characters in a written text, or we might think of the digital characters, the zeros and ones that we use in a section of software, which is to say it's not the physical attributes of these bases inside the chemical subunits inside the DNA that give DNA its function. Rather, it's the specific arrangement of those chemical subunits in accord with an independent symbol convention, which was later discovered, we now call the genetic code. So you've got genetic text expressed in accord with the genetic code in order to build the complex proteins and protein machines that keep cells alive. So a very good analogy to what's going on inside living cells would be something like computer-assisted design and engineering, which is called CAD/CAM. The way we use digital information in factories to build airplanes or automobiles or parts of various systems. And this is what's going on inside the cell. You've got digital information directing the construction of essentially mechanical parts or parts or large protein molecules that catalyze all the important reactions that keep us going. So it's a fascinating system of digital of information storage, transmission, and processing, all run by big stretches of digital information. And we know from experience that information always arises from an intelligent source. Bill Gates, our local hero out here in Seattle, says that DNA is like a software program, but much more complex than any we've ever devised. We know that programs come from programmers. We know that whenever we find information, whether it's a hieroglyphic inscription or a paragraph in a book or information embedded in a radio signal or from a computer program, it always arises from a mind, not an undirected material process. So the discovery of information and a complex information processing system at the foundation of life, and even the very simplest cells, suggests the activity of a designing mind in the origin and history of life.
Well, let's, if we can, get into the 3 chapters that you've put together, the God hypothesis and the beginning of the universe. And then you have the God hypothesis and the design of the universe. And then you have the God hypothesis and the design of life. And in each particular chapter, you're sort of answering the so what question. Let's start with the beginning of the universe. If indeed we have a beginning universe, does that then necessarily lead to some kind of theistic assumption that the universe had a beginning and that beginner is a creator?
Well, the way I argue this case in the book is to use a method of reasoning that's commonly used in the sciences, but also in philosophy and law. It's called the method of inference to the best explanation. So I lay out these 3 key facts. The universe had a beginning. The universe has been finely tuned from the beginning, and the universe shows evidence of large bursts of new information, specifically in our Earth's biosphere. And then I look at the different competing explanations for those facts, and I find materialism wanting on all three accounts. The beginning of the universe can't be explained by a prior material state because it's matter and energy that come into existence at the beginning, nor does the fine-tuning. Is the fine-tuning explained well by a materialistic hypothesis? Because fine-tuning in our experience is something that always arises from an intelligent source, just as information does. In a sense, fine-tuning and information are very closely aligned concepts. But if we think of systems that we know that are finely tuned, we might think of a French recipe, we might think of an internal combustion engine or a Swiss watch. Fine-tuning is a way of expressing the idea that there are multiple parameters that are multiple improbably set parameters that jointly accomplish some functional end or exemplify some set of functional requirements. And when we know of systems that have those features, they're invariably the product of mind. And so the fine-tuning is also best explained by positing a mind. But since the fine-tuning is present from the beginning, it couldn't be a mind within the cosmos. It must be a mind that transcends the cosmos. But then finally, we have evidence of design arising long after the beginning with the information that arises that makes new forms of life possible. And that information also points to a mind, but therefore a mind that's active in the creation. So when we add all those 3 things up, the causal profile that we need to account for all this is of an entity which transcends matter, space, time, and energy, which is intelligent and capable of structuring the whole of the universe in a finely tuned way from the beginning, and is also active in the creation after the beginning of the universe. That's not a deistic God. A space alien won't fit the bill because it can't account for the origin of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe before it would even come into existence. Materialism fails on all accounts, And so the best explanation of the ensemble of evidence that we have is classical theism, with its affirmation of a transcendent, intelligent agent who is also active in the creation.
I might just mention we're going to take a break, but if you had difficulty following that, one of the things that is so helpful about the book is there's some great diagrams where they have materialism, pantheism, deism, and then they talk about things like Big Bang or fine-tuning or DNA. And in some respects, the diagrams help sort out some of the linguistic issues and makes it much easier to understand. But we have a lot more to cover. We'll do so right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes while we continue our conversation today with Dr. Stephen Meyer. Return of the God Hypothesis, 3 significant discoveries that reveal the mind behind the universe. And Stephen, first of all, let me just mention these diagrams that I was alluding to just a few minutes ago, because they are very helpful. Some of them help us understand a little bit more about the structure of DNA. Some of them have various kinds of pictures. Sometimes they have some, if you will, sort of flow diagrams. And so in addition to the pictures of all of these scientists, some of whom I think I've read for years but never knew what they look like, or in some cases you found some pictures of some of these scientists a lot younger than I've seen them more recently, are all a very important part of the book. And so it's not just a lot of words, there's a lot of visuals that will help people understand this as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I was a college professor for 12 years and taught intro to philosophy and other science classes and things, philosophy of science classes. So I have in the book little worldview diagrams that I used to use for the students so that people can understand the concepts visually of the different philosophies that are being used as ultimate explanations for the origin of the universe or its fine-tuning or the origin of life. And I think that helps get things across. I in particular have kind of a great interest in young people and college-age students. You mentioned in your commentary during one of the breaks on this program the rise of the nuns, the religiously unaffiliated young people, the religiously unaffiliated agnostics and atheists, and how pollsters are picking up a huge increase in the number of such people. Coincident with this sense of a loss of meaning and purpose in life. There was an interesting article about that by a University of Pennsylvania psychologist in the New York Times recently about how many people are feeling a loss of meaning. He attributed it to the COVID lockdowns. I'm sure that has made things worse, but I think there's an underlying sort of metaphysical or a sense of loss of meaning, a kind of angst, and that's particularly affecting young people. And when pollsters probe that group of young people who have lost faith or who aren't willing to consider it, who are agnostic or atheistic, they found that the claims of scientists have played an outsized role in the disaffection with traditional religious belief among young people. 76% of young atheists say that the findings of science make belief in God less likely. And one of the reasons I wrote the book was to show that's not true. The findings of science are actually have decidedly theistic implications.
I would certainly agree. You know, section 4, part 4 of your book, just a lot in there, but I'm just going to pick one illustration of that, and that is where you tell the story of Thomas Nagel. Now, when your book, Signature of the Cell, came out, there were a number of reviews, and we always know how they thumbs down on Amazon and some of the science journals, but there was one that was a very positive review, and that came from a very well-known atheist, Thomas Nagel, New York University. Well, not only did he positively review your book, but then later I think he even wrote a book, Mind and Cosmos, Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False. And I would have to say that the firestorm that came down on him, and of course you expect it to come down on you, just illustrates again that even when you try to make a logical, coherent, rational presentation, if it rattles the materialistic worldview, there are some pretty stark reactions, aren't there?
Oh, absolutely. I later had lunch with Professor Nagel, and he said, how do you guys put up with this? You know, he didn't expect this because he's a great eminence in the American Academy. But he wrote a commendatory review of my book in the London Times Literary Supplement. And then there was as you say, a firestorm of correspondence from angry readers. And there was a back and forth that went on about 3 months in the letters section there. And I thought Nagel would have had enough of his brief foray into defending us, but then he doubled down and wrote a book called, this book, as you mentioned, Mind and Cosmos. And his basic point was, we live in a universe, yes, that has matter and energy in it, space and time, but we also live in a universe that includes minds. And if the materialistic account of reality can't account for the reality of mind, which is something we know better than we know anything else because we have minds, we're aware of our own minds by our direct introspective experience, then there's something missing in materialism. And so he's been a very interesting figure in this. He's still an agnostic. Maybe even he would still say he's an atheist. He said he does not want this to be the kind of universe in which God exists, but he's very unhappy with the materialistic worldview that has implied that there is no God. So he's an interesting figure to watch, and his book is certainly very interesting.
I might just mention, we won't have time to get into it, but I do want people to know that they might say, well, what about this idea of a multi-universe?
Thank you for asking about that.
What
That's
about
one of the
Stephen
most
Hawking or Boltzmann brains, or is this a God of the gaps? Maybe you can take that real quickly because we're getting close on time.
Just the multiverse, because that's the go-to atheistic explanation now. And the multiverse only works if you can posit a universe-generating mechanism so that you can portray our universe as the lucky winner of a great cosmic lottery. But the tricky part of that is that the rub of all that is that the universe generating mechanisms that have been proposed as explanations for where we got all these other universes, even in theory, require exquisite fine-tuning themselves. So to explain the origin of the fine-tuning, we posit a gabillion other universes that have been produced by an underlying universe-generating mechanism, and it turns out that that mechanism or those mechanisms themselves require prior fine-tuning. So you're right back to where we started. The multiverse doesn't explain away the fine-tuning, and instead the only known cause of systems that are finely tuned, defined as I did in the previous segment as an array of improbable factors that produce a functional outcome. The only known cause of systems that are finely tuned in that sense is intelligence. So insofar as the multiverse doesn't explain the fine-tuning, it just pushes it out of view. The best explanation for the fine-tuning of the universe remains intelligent design, a powerful reason for the return of the God hypothesis.
Yeah, it just moves it somewhere a little different. Francis Crick saying, well, maybe life didn't evolve on this planet. It evolved somewhere else and was brought here later. Well, it just moves the question off there. And same thing with the multi-universe. And most of it is self-defeating, self-refuting. So if nothing else, let me just simply say that this book is now out. And if you are certainly scientifically inclined, you will love this. But even if you don't have a real scientific background, Stephen Meyer has done such a good job of with his diagrams and other things, helping you understand why this idea of the God hypothesis that was set aside a few centuries ago is having an incredible return because of the fact that we have these scientific discoveries that certainly do point to the existence of God. And if you find yourself saying, well, I want to get a copy of the book, we have information about that on our website. If I'd like to know more about the Discovery Institute, you can follow those links as well. And Stephen Meyer, I'm just amazed at the books you've written over these years. You and I go back decades. I hate to admit how long we've known each other, but nevertheless.
We maybe shouldn't say it on the air, Kerby, but I'm always indebted to you because you were one of the guys that really helped me get started writing, and we were both around in Dallas when there was that extraordinary conference discussing these big discoveries. That was 1985 when I first started thinking about this. There was a conference that was addressing the origin of the universe, the origin of life, and the origin and nature of human consciousness from both a materialistic and theistic point of view. And it was at that conference where I first realized, I think the theists have the intellectual initiative in this discussion. Maybe there's something here.
Well, and you've done a great job of actually bringing it to the fruition. So if nothing else, been great to have you on the program. Dr. Stephen Meyer with, of course, the Discovery Institute Center for Science and Culture. And one last time, Return of the God Hypothesis, 3 scientific discoveries that reveal the mind behind the universe. Just before we go, let me just mention that we appreciate those who have been working behind the scenes, and that is Doug as our engineer today, Ivy as our producer. And if nothing else, if you find yourself saying, I really want to read a little bit more about some of this, we have posted those articles and much more on the website, which is pointofview.net. If you want to listen to it again, you can download the podcast or even watch it on YouTube. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.